This makes me think of semi-permeable membranes. Does that translate well? Semi-permeable membranes? Like in your cells, sodium ion channels. I'm just channeling from a high school biology class more than 40 years ago, right? So things can get in, but they can't get out. Oh, see, we said the magic word. So people can keep coming in here. None of us can leave.
Gerbiamieji lankytojai, jau netrukus didžiojoje salėje mūsų svečias Lawrence Schoen. Dear ladies and gentlemen, very soon in the large auditorium, Lawrence Schoen.
He did not mention the semi-permeable membrane of the door. And he left out my middle initial. There is a very strange story about why I always use my middle initial. I will not tell it to you. If you want to know the story, you have to come to the Q&A after this. I will tell the story. It's a little, maybe inappropriate for some audiences, but there is a reason. There was another Lawrence Schoen, and he didn't have a middle initial, so I use mine. But my revenge is now, he gets probably all these people asking him questions about Klingon. I am not going to speak to you about Klingon today. I think I'm supposed to talk to you about death and memory. Mostly about memory, but we'll sneak some death in there as well. This has like 30 pockets, which is sometimes wonderful, except when you try to remember where you put something. Which is where I am now. Okay. One more minute. I know, it's exciting, right? This is called building suspense. This is as a writer, you want suspense, you want anxiety, you want conflict, you want the time bomb, right? You know time bomb? There is a bomb with a time in it. It is under a seat somewhere on the train. You cannot get off the train. Can you find the bomb? Which begs the question, what will you do when you find the bomb? But you don't worry about that, because it doesn't matter if you don't find the bomb. So writing is often about time bombs. And if the book is very bad, it bombs. This is one of those places where you laugh. Very good. Okay, we're going to start talking about memory and death. Do you have the expression, wear a lot of hats? Do you know what that means? Okay, he knows. He's not wearing a hat. Imagine, if you will, every job has a hat, right? If you are a train conductor, you have one kind of hat. If you are a chef, you have another kind of hat. So if someone says they wear a lot of hats, it means they do a lot of different things. I wear a lot of hats. And that's a good thing for me, because when I write, I steal from all of these different things. Everything goes into the book. There is nothing wasted. So one of the hats I've worn in my life, I was a psychology professor. I have a doctorate in cognitive psychology, and my focus in research was memory and language. And so in my books, there's a lot about memory and language. It's not the typical science fiction. There are a lot of people who are former professors or current professors who write science fiction, and many of them are biologists and chemists and physicists, and you can see that in their books. When you land on the alien planet, they will tell you things about the composition of the atmosphere, and the gravity, and weather patterns, and geological plates, and all of these things, and they're speaking from their expertise, and they get it right. In my books, I talk about language and memory, and I hope I get it right. I'm also a hypnotherapist with the, "Ooh, you're getting sleepy." But I don't have the time to do very much of that. But the theory behind that shows up in a lot of my fiction. I run a small press, so I help other people get published, because I think that's a good thing to do. And nowadays I work the day job, as I like to call it. I work for a small medical center that does addiction treatments and mental health services. So I see people who have many more problems than I do, and I do research with them, and that's kind of exciting too. I've spent the last few months developing graphic novels for drug addicts, which is not something that I ever thought I would say on a stage in Lithuania, so here we are. But I want to talk to you about memory, because I think memory is just fascinating, and it's something we all have, except for that guy in back. And most of us don't examine it. And what I mean by that, when we talk about memory, we talk about memory as if it was one kind of thing. But in fact, there are many different kinds of memories. I'm going to talk about some of them for you. Do you know the parable? See, it's always fascinating to me what translates from culture to culture. Do you know the parable of the blind man and the elephant? Does this make any sense? No? Wonderful. I'm going to tell you a short story. So there are these blind men, and I don't know why, but they encounter an elephant. And they have never encountered an elephant before. And they are explaining to one another what it is they've found. And one wraps his arms around a leg and says, an elephant is like a tree. And another grasps the elephant's tail and says, an elephant is like a rope. And another one grasps the elephant by the trunk and says, an elephant is like a mighty serpent. And they're all right. But they don't have the whole picture, because an elephant is too big to hold on to. And so it is with memory. We have many different kinds of memory, and one of the things I think is fascinating is we've only been formally studying memory for about 120, maybe 130 years. A gentleman by the name of Hermann Ebbinghaus started this all in Germany by making up nonsense words and making lists of them and seeing how many he could remember. And under what circumstances his memory changed. I'm not intimidated by that at all. I will resist the urge to pull it back down, because if I break it, they'll make me pay for it, and I didn't exchange that many euros, so that wouldn't go over well. They don't care. So memory is like an elephant. So let's talk a little bit about different kinds of memories. And you may have heard some of these in the past. You know, we have what we refer to as semantic memory versus encyclopedic memory. So encyclopedic memory is if I say to you, what country is Bratislava in? How many people can tell me that? Okay, see, I wasn't sure. I heard it on the news this morning. I heard Bratislava, that's what it sounded like to me. Is my imitation of Lithuanian, I apologize. So that is memory for facts and for events and for things that you could look up. That's what we might call semantic memory or encyclopedic memory, as opposed to episodic memory, which is you are part of the memory. So it might be, I know that's what country that is, because I remember being in this classroom in the summer, because I was a bad student, I had to retake my history class, and I remember learning that. Episodic memory is memory about you, possibly including encyclopedic information, but you are a part of the memory. We have lots of other ways of carving up memory. We can talk about things that we know, knowing how as opposed to knowing that. You know that. You just learned, I'm here from America. That's a very different kind of memory from knowing how to ride a bicycle. How many people can ride a bicycle? Okay, anybody not know what a bicycle is? Excellent. So have you ever tried to teach someone to ride a bicycle? You say you get on the bicycle, you put your feet on the pedal, and you go. That's true. That will not help someone learn how to ride a bicycle. How do you play the piano? Oh, it's easy. You put your fingers on the keys, and the music comes out. Knowing how to do something is a very different kind of memory. And what's interesting is, often knowing how starts by knowing that. To play a piece on the piano, you first learn this finger goes here, this goes here, and you work it all out. Like driving a car. You put your hands on the wheel, you look both ways, you put your foot on the accelerator, you slowly go forward. It takes a great deal of attention, a great deal of concentration when you're first learning to drive a car. All these details you have to pay attention to. We don't do that anymore. We know how. So all those things have gone into a different kind of memory storage, and now you drive the car, you've got one hand on the wheel, you're talking to your friends, you're not paying attention because it's automatic. But automatic memory, we can call it procedural memory. Memory for how to do things is different than what we might call declarative memory. What you do to do those things. And as we move from novice to expert, the memory moves from declarative to procedural. Think about this the next time you are learning a new skill. I was some years ago, I was working with a choral director at a college I was teaching at. He said, you have all this natural resonance. I said, I'm tone deaf. He said, no one is tone deaf. I will teach you to sing if you will be in my course. I said, great, free voice lessons. And we'd be singing. I'd be taking my lessons. He would play on the piano. He'd say, sing that note. I would sing that note. And he would say, okay, now go up a fifth. How? He says, just do it. How? The psychologist in me wants to see the process. The musician in him says, just do it. Stop thinking about it. Just sing. And I opened my mouth and I went up a fifth. And he said, just like that. I said, but how did I do that? Explain it to me. Because my body knows how to do it, but I want to understand the acquisition of a new skill. And of course I can't. If you watch the process, you interrupt the process. We have memory for things that haven't happened yet. And that sounds very strange on the surface. How can you remember something that has never happened? But on Tuesday morning, I'm flying home. I remember the intention of what's going to happen in the future. That's a very different kind of memory from knowing where Bratislava is. About 1970 or so, after we've been studying memory for more than 80 years, we found a new kind of memory, which is kind of odd because, as human beings, we've had a long time to think about memory, but we found a new kind of memory. And the neat thing about it was memory without conscious retrieval. So what I mean by this, if I say to you, I give you a list. The list has a bunch of animals on it. Elephants and dogs and zebras. And I say, after you've had a chance to study this list, I say, tell me what was on the list. And you will try to remember. You will say, okay, there were elephants, there were dogs, there were anteaters, there was a giraffe, there's a water buffalo, and you may remember many of the items. Yay. if I give you another list of animals, and you study that first, second list, and I say, okay, tell me what was on the list, but only the first list. Don't tell me about any of the animals on the second list. Well, now as you try to remember, that second list starts interfering with the task. And then I give you another list of animals, and it gets harder and harder and harder. And we can do this either way. I can give you the third list of animals, and I say, only tell me animals on this third list. Don't tell me animals that were on either of the first two. And yet we're going to get intrusions from the first two lists. And your performance drops. Your memory stinks. Then I give you a fourth list of different kinds of precious stones. And your performance shoots way up again. Because the first three lists aren't interfering anymore. And that's a nice phenomenon. But this other kind of memory says you know things that you don't even know. And so if I ask you, can you remember a thing on the list? You are consciously trying to remember the things on the list. Well, I don't want to do that. I want to trick you into remembering things on the list. And a couple of researchers in California did this with children. And they went to the zoo. And they came back from the zoo, and they took the group of children, and they put them into two groups, and they asked one group, tell me all the animals you saw. Well, they were kids, they weren't paying attention, and they're tired, and they want a nap, and they want an ice cream sandwich or whatever. And they got a couple animals out of them. Not a lot. When they asked them to remember, what do you remember? Then they took the other group of kids, and they said, let's write a story together about children who went to the zoo. So these kids, like you, went to the zoo, and what did they see? And the kids start shouting out the names of animals they've seen. They're not trying to remember. They're not making an effort to remember. But they're remembering, because the only animals that they shouted out were animals they'd seen at the zoo. No other more exotic or even more common animals. No one said, cow! So we were able to tap in to their memory without them noticing this. We call this memory without awareness. And people only began studying this in the mid to late 70s, which is when I started with it. I was in graduate school. And the amazing thing was, you could read every research article that had ever been written on this subject in an afternoon. It was a great time to be a researcher, but it's a different kind of memory. And so we're back to the elephant and the blind man. But here's an interesting thing about memory, and then I'm going to take this somewhere, because some of you are going, why is he telling us this? Let's talk very briefly about forgetting. Speaking as a psychologist, speaking as a scientist, I can tell you that no one has ever proved such a thing as forgetting. We can talk about the concept, but there's evidence to suggest that once something gets into memory, it never goes away. It is there with you always. You may not be able to find it. Think of it like a folder in a filing cabinet. It's in the file cabinet. You just don't remember where you put it. But that doesn't mean it vanished. It means you can't find it. So they did this study, and remember I began by telling you how in the US we generally don't speak a lot of languages. They did this study in the Midwest, in farm country, where there were no big cities, and where they went to a high school reunion, 30-year high school reunion, and everybody who was there was white and the same Christian denomination, and had never been outside the state, and had never met anybody who spoke another language. And 30 years ago, they had all taken, in their sophomore year of high school, one semester or maybe a year of Spanish. And as part of the experiment at their 30th year reunion, they brought them all back into the classroom where they'd had Spanish. And they made them sit in the same seats. And they gave them the test that they took at the end of the semester. Tested them for a language that they had never used, never practiced in 30 years, never probably even thought about. And they all passed the test. Because it was all still there. And being in that place, surrounded by the same people, admittedly looking a little older, maybe a little fatter, some didn't have their hair, all of these things were triggers, were cues to remembering. And it was all there after 30 years without even... And if you'd ask these people, do you remember how to say whatever? They'd say, come on, it was 30 years ago and I never used the language. And they all passed the test. So there's no such thing as forgetting. And this is important to me. And now we're going to segue a little into fiction, because I'm supposed to talk about memory and death. So in my fiction, I've discovered, or it has been pointed out to me, I don't like the idea that we die. I have no problem with the idea that we die. I have the problem that when we die, everything we are goes away. That seems terribly wasteful to me. So, in the latest book, and here's the commercial, Bars, the Elephant's Graveyard. In the latest book, I took this as a problem. So one way to think about who we are is to talk about the soul. I don't want to do that. I'm a scientist, trained as a scientist. I don't know what a soul is. I don't know how much it weighs, how much space it takes up, what flavor it is. I can't tell you the characteristics, physical characteristics of a soul. This upsets my wife. She wants me to talk about and write about souls. I say no. Let's approach this from another way. Who we are, who each of you is, can be described as information. You may have heard it said that you are the sum total of your experiences. Maybe. I like to think each of us... Wait, let's go back. One more memory story. There was a surgeon, a brain surgeon, named Wilder Penfield, back in the day. And some of you may not know about brain surgery, is often you are under a local anesthetic. Because they want to talk to you while they have your head cut open. They want to make sure that you're not suddenly have lost the power of speech. So they're going to talk to you while they're poking around. Penfield has this patient on the table, and his instrument slips. And this fellow says, I see Grandma. Well, Grandma is not in the operating theater. And Penfield says, really? And he pokes at the same spot again. I see Grandma. And she's coming toward me with a fresh baked pie. This was pretty amazing. And it created a problem, which we've only recently gotten past. The idea was Penfield had poked the grandma cell in the brain. That's where the memory of Grandma and her fresh baked pie lives. And if you think of it that way, this is part of the search of what we call the engram. Engram, the basic unit of memory that exists in the brain. If you think of it that way, then I should be able to take my knife and cut out that little cell, and Grandma goes away. Well, we now know that that's not true. There was the opinion for quite a while that memory is mass action, that it's not any one part of the brain, that memory is distributed throughout the brain. And they did this not with people, fortunately, but hopefully you're not too fond of lab mice. They would take some mice, and they would teach the mice something like how to run a maze. And then they'd say, let's see what happens if we cut out this part of the brain, and we let the rat recover, and then does the rat still know the maze? We say, okay. Memory for the maze was not in that part of the brain. Let's cut out another piece of the brain from a different rat. And on and on. And they quickly discovered that across all of the rats, you can remove the entire brain, not all at once, obviously, But no particular part held that memory. So memory isn't isolated. Current research now is talking about it's not just that it's mass distributed, that it is a pattern of activation within the cells of the brain. Now, when you think that you have something, some estimates say as much as 100 billion separate neurons in your brain, and we're talking about patterns. The different patterns, the way these individual neurons, these brain cells light up relative to one another. Just think about how many combinations, if you only want to look at 5 cells among 100 billion, you get a lot of different combinations. So if we approach memory as the combinations of different patterns of stimulation, patterns of activation within the brain, when I ask you to think about soup, a certain pattern lights up in the brain. That's your pattern for soup. It's not dependent on any one cell. It's something that we see is spread across the cells. This is interesting for a lot of reasons, not least because human beings make patterns. We impose order, whether there is order to be found or not. This is why astrology works. We want to make sense of chaos. We want to look into a random pattern and say, oh yeah, this collection of stars in the sky, that's a guy, and there's a dog running after him. I don't see it. I can see the Dipper. That's easy. That other thing you insist is a bear? I don't get it. And you go to other cultures that don't have the European tradition, or even back further, the Middle Eastern tradition of naming the constellations. And they still name the constellations, they just organize them differently because we impose patterns. So what if memory, well, we know memory, we believe memory is such a complex pattern, highly organized information. What if you, the sum total of your experiences, you, the potential to respond to a question or an event, to behave in a particular way, to be you, is just such a complex pattern of information? I like this idea because we see the precursor of it in memory. So, imagine a painting on a wall, and you can see the figures in the painting. What happens if you tear the canvas away? What happens to the information that was that pattern, that organization of brushstrokes? Does it still exist? Certainly it's not hanging in a museum. So for my last book, I took the position that the information that defines who we are is not dependent upon our physicality. And I cheated. As I said, I'm a psychologist. I can tell you all kinds of things about memory that we believe to be true based on 130 years of research. But I'm not a physicist. This did not stop me from inventing a new subatomic particle for the purposes of my fiction. So I made up a subatomic particle I called a nefshon. And these are particles of memory and personality. And the idea was that every day we give off these particles. That when I talk to you, when we have an exchange, you take some of my particles with you. And when you remember our conversation, when you remember seeing me on the stage speaking to you now, you're able to do so because I've given you some of my nefshons. And when you remember me, you do so by using these nefshons. Okay? So that was good. I was okay with that. People were going, all right, so what? Who cares? And then I invented a drug that in some people, it activated the sensitivity to perceive nefshons and to manipulate them. And the idea here was, these are subatomic particles. They obey the laws of physics so that when you die, and your body, your use of these nefshons is no longer, your agency is no longer present to hold them together. They'll disperse, like any particle would. Right? This is where if I have a smoke bomb, I throw it down on the ground and you see the smoke disperse. They won't let me do that. So imagine that, if you will. And over time, the laws of physics say materials will move from an area of higher concentration to lesser concentration, and eventually everything in the universe will do this, and we'll be in equilibrium, and this is the heat death of the universe, but we're not going that far. But these nefshons will spread out. And if you are someone who can use this drug, you can pull them back in. And you might say, well, I'm going to kill you off, Heinrich. So Heinrich has died, but I remember him. We had this great conversation earlier today, and so I'm going to pull his nefshons together. And when I have enough of them, in this little mindscape I've created, I can have them take form. I have enough of one person's subatomic particles to create a simulacrum of that person, even though he's dead. And now I can have a conversation with him. And I thought that was a really cool idea. And people have said, well, that's impossible, that doesn't work. And the analogy I like to use is to point you to the night sky. Don't point this out the exceptions, we've talked about that. Point you at the night sky and acknowledge that it's possible that some of those stars you see in the sky, you're not seeing the stars. You're seeing light that those stars, in some cases, long, long ago. I don't even have the right scale of time to talk about. And some of those stars have since died. But their information is still coming toward you. And you have the sensory apparatus to perceive that. So I give this to you as a metaphor because what if who we are, the information that makes us each individuals, that defines our lives, what if that exists after we die? Always has, but we lack the sensory apparatus to perceive that. And once I had that idea in my head, I said, wait, I have this magic drug that will give you the ability to perceive these things. And now you can talk to your grandfather who died many, many years ago. Because I started out by telling you I don't like the idea of death. The death part is fine. It's just because someone has died doesn't mean they should be gone. You may have heard the expression, no one truly dies as long as we can still talk about that person and tell the stories. You remember the time with Gramps at the picnic, and a bear came and wanted his sandwich, and Gramps wouldn't give him the sandwich. And, well, now we know how Gramps died. But, if I tell you this story, and as long as we keep telling these stories, that person stays alive. Perhaps only to the other people in the room who heard the stories. And I've written other stories, other fiction about that idea. With Boris, the elephant's graveyard, I took that to another level and made up a science behind it and rules for it, and then wrote a novel around that idea. And it was a lot of fun. And I got to do that because I started with real ideas about memory and how memory works, and the notion that I didn't want everybody to die. So this is probably some sort of wish fulfillment for me, because I'm constantly talking to friends and relatives who have died. They don't talk back. That's a good thing, I suppose. but I wanted them to. And so the dedication in the book is to family members and friends, and an old dog who have long since died, that I still converse with on a regular basis. The dog, even in life, the dog never talked back to me, but others did. And so I think the dedication is something like, this is for them. I had to admit nefshans so I could stop talking to them, or something like that. So all of this may be just me talking about my own neuroses and need to get through it, but I like to think more than just that. It's taking real aspects of science, in this case social science, psychology, good thing we're in this building, and applying them to issues in science fiction and giving them a little tweak and seeing where that gets to take us. To further complicate things in this book, there are no human beings. And in fact, our protagonists are elephants. See, we started with elephants. Our protagonists are uplifted elephants. Elephants who don't remember that they come from Earth because everybody's forgotten that. And they've been given the power of speech and language. And they walk upright and they have opposable thumbs. And they build cities and they send their kids to school and they do science and on like this. And they live in a galaxy that is filled with hundreds of worlds that have been populated by other anthropomorphic species, other uplifted mammals. And there are bears and there are jaguars and there are dogs, and all the animals on those lists I was referring to are, well, I didn't do giraffes, but prairie dogs and gophers and lots of animals. And they all hate the elephants, because the elephants don't look like that. The elephants don't have fur. All the other ones do. The elephants have these stupid-looking ears. And they have trunks that are dexterous and as useful as an extra hand. That's disgusting. And so, 800 years before the book begins, all the other races in what we call the Alliance gathered up all the elephants, of which we had 2 species, gathered up all the elephants and put them on a planet nobody liked. Because it rains every day, and if you have fur, that's not a good thing. And it doesn't just rain every day, it rains constantly every day. And so they gave it to the elephants, and the elephants said, okay, fine, leave us alone, go away, we don't want to talk to you anymore. And they live in a series of islands, 2 archipelagos on this rainforest, on this rainy world. And every island is a rainforest. And so the elephants built their cities in the trees, just because I like the idea of elephants living in trees. And they discovered in the rainforest a pharmaceutical wonderland, a pharmacopoeia. There's a fun word to try to translate. And among the many drugs that they developed was the drug for speaking to the dead. And suddenly the Alliance said, well, we want that. Give it to us. And the elephant said, sure, you can have anything you want. Now leave us alone. And that was the deal. And at the time of our book, and by the way, the name of the planet they're on is Barsk. At the time of the book, some members of the Alliance have decided, we don't like this situation. We don't like having somebody else control substances, particularly this drug for speaking to the dead, but a lot of other drugs. And we can only get it from one place, and we have to deal with people we loathe and despise to do it. And now I had a book. I had a conflict. And a very thin metaphor for talking about intolerance, which some people have picked up on and other people have not, and that's fine too. But all of this comes from memory, and studies of memory and language, and the distinction between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, which I like to play with from my work with hypnosis. And I could go on and on and on like this, as I've been known to do, because as I used to tell my students when I was a professor, they would come into my office with their new course schedule, And I would say, oh, these are good psychology classes you're taking. Where is a foreign language? Why are you not taking any literature classes? How about some chemistry? And they would say, Dr. Schoen, I'm a psychology major. And I would say, you will have the whole rest of your life to be a psychologist. Now you are at a university, you're at a college, where they are giving you everything else. Take some of it. And they would say, but I'm never going to use it. And then I would bite their heads off. Because and I tell you this as an author, and I tell you this as a human being. You use everything. Everything goes in here, and everything, as a writer, comes back out from the fingers. Nothing is wasted. Everything colors the way you look at other things. I think about psychology differently for having taken a one-semester course in geology. I think about geology differently for having studied Japanese. I think about Japanese differently because it's different from everything else. And I think about the language this way because, and I tell this to people when people ask me why I study Klingon. Because study any language other than your native language both teaches you things about language with a capital L and gives you insights into your own languages and allows you to speak more eloquently and use the language more effectively because you know things that people who have only studied your native language would never occur to even think about. So we started out with memory and death, but the big message here is that nothing is wasted and everything's important, and you get to decide. And on the few minutes I have left, to tease you into the Q&A that follows in another room when we leave here, I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions, and then he's going to take the mic away and make me leave. But I've got a few minutes? Okay, so do we have any questions, or have I intimidated you all? Yes, you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. You were speaking about you were speaking about everybody, every person still alive in some meaning till we are speaking about it, till we are telling some stories about this person. So what's about the fictional people? When you write a novel, you make them to be alive in some meaning.
But those people, since they never existed, they never had nefshans. So there's a creature in the book, not a creature, a machine, that humans build, I will tell you, they build in about 200 years. They build an archive called the Archetype of Man. And it has all of our stories in it. And they send it out into space so that in case there are aliens, the aliens will find out who we are by having our stories. And when they find this, they destroy it. Some characters in the book destroy it because it refers back to a time that we don't talk about. And then my protagonist, here's a big spoiler, my protagonist uses nefshans to recreate that machine. Because being a thinking machine, it gave off nefshans, not the way people do. They felt very differently to him, but there was enough that he could summon it and talk to it. And in the sequel that I'm writing now, okay, not a spoiler, but a cool bit. So among these elephants, they have their own cultural beliefs, and one of them is that every now and then a child is born as a mistake. Shouldn't have been born. Physiologically, conception should never have happened, and it does. And when it does under these rare circumstances, the resulting child typically has all sorts of birth defects and other abnormalities that led to its being conceived in the first place. And as a society, when such a child is born, they leave the infant out in the public square. And the parents deny that they're parents. And the infant normally dies very quickly. Maybe, on random acts of kindness, we'll live a year or two. But no one will acknowledge that this child exists. No one will look at it. No one will speak to it. gets no affection. One of the characters in the novel is such a child, and he's 6 years old. And he should not live, he should not exist. And he lives in a very different world. And part of the reason for this was so I could show the other side of intolerance. Here we have a species that is loathed and hated by everybody else in the galaxy, and they do the same thing to one of their own. So we get both sides of the issue. Am I out of time?
Yeah.
Not even one more question?
Well, I think that...
See this man, he's so eager to ask a question.
Well, yes, but we really have to move on with the program. However, there will be a Q&A session with Lawrence happening upstairs on the 3rd floor, just going up the stairs afterwards. So if you want to...
You're all invited.
To ask him more questions, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer.
I will be very happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay,
Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you. On behalf of the organizers, here's a little keynote.
And it's in English.
I'm sorry, my Klingon is not good enough to write a thank you note in Klingon.
You would only confuse people. Thank you very much. And thank all of you. I hope you're having a great time at the convention.